I want to introduce Matt on the podcast. He is the host of the Statist Quo podcast. Matt, how are you?
Pretty good, man. How about you?
Awesome, yes.
Here.
Oh, my pleasure entirely. So I want to get right down to business. We're kind of under some time constraints, and it took a little while to get this get organized here, but we made it happen. I'm on Twitter. I'm following you and a couple other guys. You're, as far as I can tell, you guys are liberty-minded people.
Yeah, for sure.
With I guess some unique exceptions. How would you identify yourself? Like, I guess, like a conservative? Are you more of a libertarian? Are you kind of a conservative with kind of some exceptions? You tell me.
I don't personally think that I have any exceptions. As a matter of fact, I think I would call myself a libertarian. And matter of fact, I would describe myself as such a pure libertarian. I believe that society is self-ordering, and I'm actually an anarcho-capitalist. So I don't see the need for government at all.
Oh, wow. Okay. So this is interesting, because I was actually, that surprises me. I had thought that you were kind of more of a, I guess maybe more like, maybe not conservative, but like an anti-left kind of person, but with like an exception about like the military. And we'll get into that, because I think you have some unique views on that. But sure. you anarcho-capitalist, anarcho-capitalist, you said, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
I know, like, a lot of people get kind of the perception that I am a conservative because I talk about the Constitution a lot. Mm-hmm. But usually, and to be honest, I really don't care about the Constitution too much. I didn't sign it. But I do care about the Bill of Rights, and I care about the protections that are in it. And I think I think that we honestly, look, man, we don't live in an anarcho-capitalist society, not by any means. So I think that the protections that we do have from government that do exist, as much as they've been diluted, I think that they're worth saving. Mm-hmm. And especially, I like to talk about the Constitution because it's a good tool to see just how far away our modern government is from where it's supposed to be. Mm-hmm. So the problem with the problem with this kind of excuse me, the problem with this kind of political view is the fact of the matter is that my ideal society is so far and away from what exists today, and then the whole philosophy is based on a set of principles, right? So the problem is we don't live in that society. So a lot of times you can't just like blindly follow the principles to where they lead, and as a matter of fact, you have to take the world as it is. So when talking about like what your position should be on issues, you have to take that into account. So the waters, I think, get muddy pretty quickly. Okay,
that's interesting. You're obviously upset with how the government's being run now. I think everyone would agree with you on that. As a constitutional conservative, as that's kind of how I identify. I ground everything in the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. Same as you. And I mean, yeah, there's no doubt that that the government is not. It doesn't resemble anything of what it was back when they ratified it. But would you? So, but as an anarchist, and this is kind of one of the problems I've had with kind of anarchy generally, is that would you be upset if the Constitution, let's say we were able to get rid of all the illegitimate stuff and we actually had the real Constitution? Would you be kind of more satisfied with that? Would that be okay with you, or would you still want to just abolish government entirely?
I would be much, much happier. I would still want to abolish government, certainly, because of the way that we view government. And the fact of the matter is, government is a monopoly on violence in a territorial area. That even if you go look in like political science textbooks, that is what a government is. And a government cannot operate without, the whole philosophy kind of boils down to this, is the non-aggression principle, right? Mm-hmm. And that basically says, don't hurt people, don't take their stuff. It is immoral to initiate aggression on somebody else. Mm-hmm. Now, that doesn't mean people are pacifists. It's fine for you to defend yourself and your property and your family and things like that. But, however, the problem with government is that everything government does is based around coercion. The state only has one tool in its toolbox, and that's coercion. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, during the kind of classical liberal period, like the Adam Smith, John Locke kind of era, and especially the founders had this view a lot, that they thought the government was, they saw, and one thing I do appreciate about the founders is that at least they had kind of a realistic view of government compared, people today think government is government's here to protect you and help you and to do all these things. It's No, it's not.
Mm-hmm.
And at least the founders saw that government is an evil. They saw it. They believe it's a necessary evil. I happen to disagree. But however, getting back to the subject at hand, so everything that government does, it's through, it has to raise funds almost entirely through money that's coerced out of other people's taxation. And we view taxation as theft because the fact of the matter is, if you don't pay your taxes for long enough, eventually men with guns come to your house and throw you in a cage. So therefore, pretty much everything government does is illegitimate. Now, you can certainly make like a consequences argument. You can say that, well, some things that government does are good. And I'm not saying that everything government does is bad. I think that everything government does has unintended consequences, which is another argument. But back to your question, if we had an actual federal republic with the independent states as sovereign entities and the federal government was only limited to its 30 or 35 powers, I'd be much happier, absolutely. Now, I would still push for the entire, the abolition of the state, but it'd be much, much better. And I think we'd have a much more harmonious and happier society than we do today. And I mean, I don't know, man. It's not like I'm an ideologue. I think if somebody can show me, if we happen to live in society, and somebody could show me that things, we don't have all these real serious problems like we do in the United States today, I might change my mind. So it's not the fact, like, I'm not anti-government because I hate government. I'm anti-government because of the moral problems that you have with government.
But you don't see that would you be willing to concede that maybe anarchism has its own consequences? I think probably the most obvious one is that, you talk about the non-aggression principle where like, oh, it's just this, a lot of guys talk about that as if it's this universal idea that it's in men's hearts. And I don't see that demonstrated anywhere in the world. I see that if you don't have a government and you just have anarchy, then all that means is that the strongest person is going to rise up to be the king or the leader. And whatever that person decides, whoever's bigger and stronger, he can take your property unless you can stop him. He can decide whatever's going on, and no one's going to stop him because no one has any sort of authority except for what they can physically do with their hands.
Well, the thing is, though, is that people, when it's kind of, I can understand why, because when it's phrased like that, it might sound strange, but the fact of the matter is, you follow the non-aggression principle every day, and so do I, and so does everybody else. I mean, we don't walk around hitting people and shooting people and robbing from people and stealing from people. Almost everybody on the planet does. I mean, yeah, there's a small criminal element in every society, absolutely. But the fact of the matter is, the vast majority of people, this is how they live their lives. And the fact of the matter is, but the thing is, we just make this one exception for government. That's really because most people. And that's kind of the entire underpinning of the philosophy. However, people think anarchy means chaos, though. It means just like no rules whatsoever. And that's not necessarily the case. I mean, there's plenty, okay, so for example, in an anarchist society, like a totally voluntary society where all transactions are voluntary, where there's no government, no taxes, no nothing like that, we still have police, we'd still have courts, we'd still have law. And it's not that crazy because there's several times in human history where actually there was a decentralized legal system. Because like a lot of kind of minarchists and constitutional conservative types, they at least a degree of them, they don't want any government whatsoever except for the police, the courts, and the military, right? So that's probably something you've seen and ranted into before. And the idea behind that is that there's only can be one agency that has these powers. But if you go back to the 1800s when police, like the London Metropolitan Police and whatnot, you ever heard of the Peelian principles?
No. Could you explain those briefly?
Sir Robert Peel, who was the founder of the London Metropolitan Police Department, he had these principles for his police officers. And when the police agency started there, it only, like everybody that was cops, they didn't have guns and badges, and they didn't have power to enter people's houses and execute search warrants, whatnot like that. No, what they had actually was the same rights and the same abilities that anybody else had to stop crimes. So,
they were security officers, basically.
Yeah,
like as we would understand it.
Yeah. Compared to our modern perception, sure. However, and a lot of people think that wouldn't work, but that's partly because, like, look at all the things that are illegal in today's society. So you can't have any pot. You cannot park your car on the wrong side of the road. You can't, buy goat's milk on a Thursday if it's between 65 and 70% relative humidity. So we have all these crazy laws, and that's what requires this massively empowered police force. But I think that, in a totally voluntary society, we're going to have a lot less laws, and they're going to be things that are going to be enforceable by everyday people. The only base law on most of these things, but let me back up real quick first, because I'm skipping over something here.
Sure.
So we have private property in a society. Like, we have public property in today's society, where essentially anybody can come onto public property. There's no way for any government or anybody else to limit access to it. So you have this huge problem there, where it's like, so let's say that two groups, want to have a free speech rally that, hate each other or something like that. Well, who gets to use it? So we have all these kind of problems with public property. But in a private property society, every single piece of property is privately owned. So first off, the owner gets to decide who comes on the property and who doesn't. And then second off, the owner has if you are going to enter a piece of property, then you have to agree with the owner asks you to do. So let's say there's a shopping mall, right? And one of the rules of the shopping mall is so you can't have drag queen story time down here, or whatever. There's no public nudity here or anything like that. So by entering that piece of property, you're agreeing to the owner's rules. So there are ways for us to have order in the society, and for everything else, that's what the court system's for. So we have, essentially, like, if you go back to natural law, which is what the founders believe, right? There was really only 5 crimes under natural law, and that's murder, rape, theft, coercion, and I can't remember the last one, assault, like violence. These are things that everybody, that we, by virtue of us being human beings, are immoral to do to somebody else. So that's a good basic foundation for a legal system. And there's a really good paper. I'm not super well versed in this type of thing. There's a really good paper called Private Law and Defense by Bob Murphy that goes into how these things would work much better than I'll be able to do it justice here. So we have these types of things. And then, as far as like punishment, like removing people from society, I guess I didn't go back. So every piece of property, there's 1,000 different solutions for this. One would be, since we have privately owned property, say you have a neighborhood that gets together and decides, well, we want to have somebody patrol our streets. So there's police agencies still. They just don't have all these police powers that normal police have. So they have the ability to, stop people. They have the ability to make arrests for these 5 things that I just mentioned, and anything else gets taken to the court system. However, because we have private property in the society, then you can exclude anybody that you want. So if you see somebody that says, kind of in your neighborhood, and maybe he's peering in your neighbor's window or something like that, well, you have the ability to tell him to leave. And if the guy doesn't leave, then you call the private agency, they remove him from the property. And so the point I'm getting at here, and I'm not doing a very good job.
It's a big question, I know, and it's there's so many. Once you go down one road, you think of this, and there's a tangent here. But finish your thought. I'm going to kind of bring it back a little bit, but finish your thought.
Okay, so the point here is that I think people have the perception that anarchy means like chaos, like everybody just does whatever they want, but that's not really the case, because the way that people behave in an anarchist society is going to be the way they behave today. And yeah, you might be able to say, well, yeah, but the state's there and people know if they do something they'll get in trouble. Well, I mean, maybe, look at the rate of murders and rapes and whatnot that are solved today. It's pathetically low. It's in like the 30 or 40%. It's like you have more than a 1 out of 2 chance of getting away with a murder if you commit one in the United States law and jurisdictions today. So I don't think that the state being there is any type of deterrent. And the fact of the matter is, most people want to live peacefully. And for that small criminal element in society, there are ways of handling them and ways of ensuring that there is order in society. And so as far as like criminal actions against other people, there are private security means for that, and everything else. Let's say your neighbor's playing their music too loud at 3 a.m. Well, that's what the courts are for. So instead of just one centralized court where we have a common police court for the county, let's say there's, several different arbitration companies or something like that. And people, since this is a market system, we have market forces operating all these things. So now, a judge in the county can basically do whatever they want because, they're appointed or maybe they're elected, but they're not really accountable to anybody. Because number one, most judges run unopposed. And number two is that, nobody is kind of going through court records saying, oh man, this guy right here, he decided this case last year. I'm not going to vote for him. I'm going to vote for the guy. Nobody does that. They just click the box. So there's really no check on judicial power in America. However, when we have competition, when there's more than one judge, then the judicial powers are incentivized to be fair. Just like the police in this age, because you might say, well, there's nothing to stop the cops from just beating the crap out of everybody, and that may be true, but however, there are market forces at work here. So let's say if you run the shopping mall, like I was talking about, like you don't want to hire somebody that goes around just beating the crap out of potential customers because you're going to lose the business. So, and then the police, because you can fire them, because you can't fire the cops in your hometown, right? Because you can fire the police, then they realize, well, we better behave. So there are market forces here. And hey, if they do a terrible job, you're fired. You go hire somebody else. And you don't have to. So there are checks instead of like the democratic checks we think it's. There are checks in a market system because basically everything in anarchist society comes down to the market. Everything is voluntary transactions. And then because of that, you have multiple actors in each of these arenas. Just like, so let's say you're my neighbor, you're playing your music at 4 a.m. and you've been doing it for weeks now. And I keep coming over there and asking you to stop. And you just tell me, F off. And so I say, all right, fine. So I'm going to take you to court because you are, disturbing the quiet enjoyment of my property. And you would take your case to one of these judges, and you and I would have to agree on one. We would have to, and of course, there's also types of things. There could be contracts for the place you live that says that you're going to use one of these, number of arbitration agencies, something like this, so on and so forth. And basically, that judge that we go to is incentivized to be fair to both of us because if he, let's say I slip him $20 and he decides in my favor. Well, you find that out, you're going to tell everybody. Word's going to get out, and then nobody's going to want to bring him business because who wants to go in front of a judge who's not fair? So,
or they'll go to him because they know they can buy him off.
Yeah, but then
I get what you're saying, though. I get it just seems to me like there's a lot of government still involved in anarchy. I didn't envision that there would be a police force and a court system, and for those things to exist, I think you need some kind of law, some kind of standard by which to in your case of the music and the neighbors, there has to be some kind of ordinance, because otherwise you're going to have all sorts of claims. And in today's systems, there's something you need to have standing, and it just seems like there still is quite a lot of law that I wasn't aware of in an anarchist system.
Yeah, well, any society is going to have some type of law, and what we had before, what we have today with ordinances and prime restraint. What we had before that was a common law system, which is what we got from the English, and the entire case law was built on judges deciding, court decisions, and that's how it was built up to build what was really a decentralized bottom-up legal system. And another thing too, there is a difference between government and the state, right? So there is government. Civil administration is one thing, but the state signifies something entirely different. And yes, people in in a completely stateless society are going to be performing functions that are done today by the state. Certainly, because we need these things in society. We need a security force. We need a defense force. We need somebody to settle disputes. We're still going to need these things. People are not going to just evolve. And part of the problem is this too, is that in our modern conception, the way things work now, this society has never really existed. So it's kind of hard for me to say what exactly it would look like.
Of course.
It's more of a thing of I know what I believe is moral and what I believe is not. And the only thing that I can see that's actually moral is a society where every transaction is voluntary and consensual. Nobody is allowed to use aggression on somebody else. Nobody gets an exception from the not against aggression principle, which is why that I'm against the state. So, and there are people that are far more qualified than me to answer this. Not something I've spent a lot of time on recently, but I can certainly point you in the right directions. But anyway, back to your thing. So you can have government. Let's say a bunch of you and your neighbors get together when you all voluntarily agree, hey, let's have a homeowners association to help us make sure that we all keep our properties nice and keep our property value up, or whatever. That's fine as long as everybody agrees to it. But there is a difference between that and between having like a civil state there where it says, okay, well, we're going to tax you a percentage of your money, and if you don't pay us, then we're going to come to your house and throw you in a cage. But in return for that, we're going to give you this, that, and this other thing. I mean, there's a pretty big difference between governance and a state in these two things. So there is that distinction. It's entirely possible that you could have a community, because keep in mind, this entire, we're not talking about some large national area that has the same private defense company or has the same legal system or anything like that. I mean, this is a decentralized system. So you might have one community that decides, you know what, we want a government-like structure. You might have another community that, people there decide, well, we don't want anything like that. So the point here is that one consequence of this philosophy, it's the idea that people are better suited. Individuals know what's best for them better than somebody else does. Mm-hmm. Like my representative here, I've never met him. He has no idea who I am. Mm-hmm. He's never met me before. He doesn't know what I want and what I don't. And I don't even know if I voted for the guy or not. I can't remember. Mm-hmm. But the point is that he doesn't know what's best for me better than I do. He couldn't possibly. And the other problem is that there's me and there's 699,999 other people in his district that he represents. So how can he possibly represent my interests and then somebody else's if I want to own an AR-15 and the person across the street from me, he's also representing, wants people with guns to come to my house and take it by force and kill me if they need to. Mm-hmm. So, that's the idea, is that part of it anyway is that people are better able to make decisions for themselves than somebody else is. And there's like this idea, it really started in the progressive era, where we have like this, the kind of the governmental paternalism we see a lot of today, where we have things like, oh, we need to put a warning label on Tide Pods so people won't eat them, or, all this crazy stuff like this, like the caution hot on coffee cups, like all this kind of stuff that got this, it's called, the whole kind of the legal system is called prior restraint. So it's a law in place to stop people from doing something before they do it, and part of the problem with that type of system is that it indemnifies people that follow these regulations. So if McDonald's puts this cup of coffee, label on there, or actually, no, I got a better example. So let's say the EPA. So that we have pollution controls today, right? So if a factory follows all these pollution control things, like all the regulations and whatnot, but they still have, let's say that some of their toxic chemicals leach into your groundwater and your kids get sick, you're standing to sue them is going to be significantly diminished, and the amount of liability that the company has is going to be much, much lower than it would be otherwise, because of that prior restraint, because the laws there like essentially indemnify people from their, the consequences of their actions. Are
you talking about today's society, or like? Yes. Really? Yeah. I think if especially with pollution, given that, we're very environmentally conscious here, I think that if you had, I think that's you'd have a lot of standing to sue like a company that was poison. I mean, actually, over here in Connecticut, we actually have a situation locally going on like that, and it's kind of a big deal. It's a dumping situation, and well, I guess it might be a little different, but I think if you're poisoning the water and someone gets sick, I think even if you're like, well, we told you to not build a house there or something, I think you're still going to get screwed.
I mean, it's possible, but that's like the whole thing behind the legal system. That's the idea behind prior restraint. Mm-hmm. And
I just think today, we have so many reasons, so many reasons to appear in a courtroom. Someone can sue anyone else for almost anything now. I mean, we're very, I think they ultimately call it tort reform, where it's just, there's so many laws. I love, a long time ago, I did this research, and I found that in 2011, the Congressional Research Service tried to count the number of federal criminal offenses. And
70,000.
Oh, they actually found a number?
Yeah, I mean, I know what you're talking about.
This is 2011. They said they couldn't even count them. They said they couldn't do it. And their best guess was it was tens of thousands. So if they actually came up with 70,000, that's news to me.
It might be there's 70,000 pages in the Federal Register, not actual criminal
in the Federal
statutes.
Register, I think it's got to be 1 million pages. The Federal
For criminal
Register,
law?
the Federal Register, yeah, is it depends, I guess, how you count it. Because I know guys who deal with it say that, listen, some of the book is just kind of proposals, kind of things that aren't actually laws. I'm not exactly sure how much are laws and how much aren't, but I mean, the last time I checked in like 2009, that thing was 700,000 pages long and growing every year. I mean, an insane number. And it's like, here's the Federal Register, total collection of federal laws and proposals. And how many of us have read even a single page of that?
Oh, nobody's read it, man.
And
but
yet,
here's the thing.
Oh, go ahead.
You are expected to follow every single one of them, and ignorance of the law is not an excuse, of course, unless you're a police officer, which the Supreme Court has decided on multiple occasions that the police can arrest you for something if they think it's a crime.
Yeah, I mean, that's basically, I mean, you can't resist arrest, at least in some states, like in Connecticut, you can't.
No.
Even if it's an illegitimate arrest, you just have to just take it and then deal with it in court, which, I guess I don't hate entirely, but I do want there to be consequences at the end of it if it's found that there was some abuse that happened. I don't want people fighting cops, really. I don't think that's effective. I don't think that's the right way to do it.
Well, especially in today's media climate, even if you're totally righteous and justified, they're going to be able to spin it into something else, and they'll be able to grab more power for themselves. But the thing is that I actually did want to go back to something you said a minute ago. You said something about us being environmentally conscious, and there's actually people like the mainstream today. They're concerned about climate change, but I think as far as like actual like water pollution and things like that, they don't care about it at all, man.
It's all about control. It's not about anything else other than control, in my opinion.
Oh no, for sure. And I live like in fracking country, and there's plenty of I have a couple friends that I grew up with that they drink nothing but bottled water because they literally can't drink their tap water. And they've tried multiple times to file suits against the companies that were doing all the hydraulic fracturing. They got thrown out every time. So there is. I'm not saying it's one-to-one perfect every time it'll be like this, but there is a lot of protection, especially for corporate powers. As long as they're following the rules that the regulatory body has set in place, there are restrictions on what they can be sued for.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Sorry, I keep interrupting. Go ahead.
That's all good. Vaccines are another one, of course. Like the vaccine manufacturers are indemnified against all kinds of damages. Same thing.
Oh, interesting. Okay, I want to kind of go back to almost the beginning of the conversation a little bit. You had mentioned that you had mentioned the government generally, historically speaking, it's just it's a monopoly on force. Correct. As far as I can tell, governments only do one thing: they get bigger and bigger and bigger, and they get more powerful. They get more tyrannical. It's almost a given. And what I think is unique about the founders is that when you read the Declaration of Independence, it talks about the purpose of government. And I think up until that point, I feel like every government was kind of just like, no, we're going to be top down because, you need order. It's better than chaos. It's better than living nomadically. It's this kind of natural progression towards kind of a society. And they said that, the purpose of government, the only legitimate purpose of government is one that protects rights. Like, that's the only purpose for it. That's the purpose.
Yes.
All the laws need to be that. Law enforcement needs to be about protecting rights. Judging needs to be about protecting human rights. The purpose of government entirely is all about protecting, individual rights, which include, property rights.
Right.
I guess, now that you've described anarchism, a little more clearly than I've done, the research on my own, that it has more of these elements of government. I really see them kind of more similar than I did before. I feel like if we transported back into 1776, I bet you would probably be totally fine with those conditions.
Yeah, I think I would. I think I would probably, for the most part. Yeah, I'm sure that I would have revolted against the British for the same reason that I'm an anarchist today. However, there is, I think, and that's something. There's a paper. I can't remember who wrote it, but it was called "The Liberty of the Ancients versus the Liberty of the Moderns," and it talked about how much more free people were in generations past, and it was mostly a technological thing. It was because the state physically could not actually control large amounts of territory, so it mostly had to leave people to their own devices. And also, Another thing, there's a book called Tragedy and Hope. I don't know if you've ever read it or heard about it. It's really good, man. I think you'd enjoy it. It's by a guy named Carroll Quigley. He was a professor at some university. But basically, one of the ideas the book talks about how there was, whenever there's been parity between weaponry that the government has and weaponry that the citizenry has, there's been people's rights are respected. So back in the feudal days, the Dark Ages, whatnot, I mean, barons, like feudal lords had knights, right? Mm-hmm. Mounted soldiers in metal armor that were far superior to anything else. And people had no rights. People were dominated and controlled. And then what happened was gunpowder was invented. And then guys with hand cannons started blowing knights off their horses. And the age of gunpowder, that's when we had the Revolution, the American Revolution. That's when we had classical liberalism. That's when we had the founding of America. So we had all these things where there was a huge advancement in human liberty. But now you look at, today's U.S. military versus the weaponry your average civilian can get their hands on. I mean, certainly, yeah, you could fight a guerrilla war with it. There's certainly plenty to do that. Mm-hmm. However, though, there's such an imbalance here that the state has, and what you've seen is that the state has started to encroach on liberties once again. But anyway, back to your original question there. Yeah, I think I probably would be, for the most part, fine with it, because I'm not so married to this idea. I think morally it's impossible to have a government that's actually just, because of how it gets its funding and what it does. But if we had a government that actually did nothing but protect the rights of people, I probably would be fine with that. I don't know how possible it is, though, man.
Yeah. No, you're right. Finish your thought, because I'm going to chime in on that, because you're right.
Sure. I think one thing that we can see from the American experiment is the failure of the idea of limited government. It's a great idea. And honestly, if the government just protected rights, there were only laws against, physically injuring, killing, raping, stealing from other people, I would be cool with that. However, we went from the smallest government in world history to the biggest. And I don't know if that totally kills the idea of limited government, but it certainly poses a major challenge to it. Now, of course, the founders said that, it's a republic. Thomas Jefferson said it's a republic if you can keep it. So his idea
Franklin.
was...
I think it's Franklin.
Oh, yeah, you're right. But his idea...
Sorry, I
just... get those two confused. No, you're right. I always get those two confused, man. Like
I've done it myself. No worries.
Yeah. But there's, that was the idea. It's a republic if you can keep. Basically, what he meant is that we need to have an active and involved citizenry, because the nature of government is to grow and expand.
Yeah.
And if it's not stopped, that's exactly what it's going to do.
Yeah.
Because, the fact of the matter is, people in power, people that like to control and dominate others, that's who goes into government. It's not people that like to leave other people alone and live harmoniously. People go into government because they want to control people.
Well, it's rare. I mean, I think there's some exceptions, but I think you nail what is it? You hit the hammer. I always get
hit nail on the head.
Hit the nail on the head. Yes, you hit the nail on the head with it. Because generally speaking, I mean, that's I agree entirely that most people who are in government are there for the wrong reasons. Definitely.
Yeah. Now, I think some people do go into government for the right reasons, like they want to help. However, the way that they are going to help is by controlling people. So,
yeah,
and you get some of that kind of progressive mindset where, like, the I know what's best for you kind of mentality that we saw in the progressive era. So, anyway, I mean, I don't know, man. Maybe if we had more things like Shays Rebellion and the Whiskey Rebellion, maybe if these events were more frequent and more common, maybe the whole arc of American history is totally different. Maybe we still have a constitutional system that that has most of the power delegated to the states and very little delegated to the federal government. However, that's not how history's played out. And also, I think something else that we have to keep in mind too with that era, I personally believe the Constitution was a coup. And I'll explain to you what I mean. Here, so
I think I've heard this argument, but go ahead.
So we originally had the Articles of Confederation, right? That was, and one thing people don't realize is that when we go back to the founding era, the common people, like a lot of people think that the commoners, like the soldiers, like the privates and whatnot, just the regular people in the Revolution, they fought because they were either conscripts or they wanted slaves or land or something like that. And it's like, no, you can go back and read the writings. And actually, there's a book called American Insurgents, American Patriots that talked about motivations for people fighting in the Revolutionary War. And these people believed the ideals of liberty. They believed in freedom and natural rights and things like that. I mean, they really did. It wasn't just the founders. a full year before any of these guys in knee breeches and powder wigs got together and wrote a mean letter to King George, these guys declared their independence by shooting at British soldiers. I mean, 1775 was actually, it was 74 is when the revolution started. Lexington and Concord was what, a full year almost before the Declaration, or something like that. I can't remember the exact date, but it was later on, like the what we think of the elites, like the peoples whose names we know today, the founders, they jumped on this too. And of course, keep in mind, when the Declaration of Independence was first being debated, there were a lot of people that wanted to get back into the British colonies. John Dickinson,
the loyalist.
Yeah. Well, it also is the kind of the people that didn't want. They were, they had pro-independence. You had a pro-independence group of rebels, then you had like a conciliatory like group. John Dickinson, the Penman Revolution, he was like the arch conservative out of all these guys. So then the other half, you had people that really truly believed in the ideals, I think, like people like Patrick Henry or Richard Henry Lee, like these types of guys.
Anti-federalists.
Yeah, and then you had the other group, which is people like Sam Adams and John Adams, James Madison, Washington, guys that really, gotta keep in mind, a lot of these guys were oligarchs, and they didn't really have any problem with the British system except for the fact that they were not running it. And I think a lot of them wanted to have the British system over here, just have themselves be on the top of it. So the war's over, right? The U.S., what's now the colonies, what's now the United States wins, and then we get the Articles of Confederation. And it wasn't, if you look in your high school history book, it'll tell you that it was too weak of a government. That's why it didn't work out. It didn't have any power to tax, blah, blah, blah. And then originally the framers of the Constitution went to go to Philadelphia to amend it, right? Well, they had met in secret, didn't tell anybody what was going on, shut the door, shut the windows for days, and come out with this brand new document. And people don't talk about this. People were pissed back then, man. They didn't want that. A lot of people, even regular people, saw it as too centralized. They said it's too much central power.
Oh yeah, then the great debate ensued, and we had the Anti-Federalist Papers and the Federalist Papers, and now we have the whole ratification period, and yeah, I can't remember his name. I just had it in my head. He's the gentleman who is leading the now Convention of States project, which is a group that are looking to amend the Constitution to bring it back to the original principles of it. And one of the common criticisms that he faces is that exact argument, is that, we can't do an Article 5 convention because, the last time we did it was a coup, basically, like you're suggesting. And, I haven't read the whole, he does a huge dissertation basically on it. It's like 100 pages long, going into like these really specific details about it. I'll have to send it to you.
Okay, yeah, definitely.
He makes the case that it wasn't a coup at all, that the whole time it was with the consent of the federal Congress. It was with the consent of the states. And the states were interacting themselves. today, the states don't really, they don't even talk to each other. Back then, they were talking to each other all the time. They themselves sent delegates to do this with their own authority. And and the states had more authority than the Confederate Congress then.
Yeah.
So there's some nuances there that I think you might find interesting.
There is. I do think, though, as far as that modern idea, I don't think we're going to get a better deal than we already have, because I think if the Bill of Rights was going through Congress today, it wouldn't even make it out of the honestly.
Yeah. Oh God. No, you're right. But I want to, I'm going to kind of go back to what you're saying earlier about,
Sure.
your, I guess, how would I word it? Your dismay for the Constitution and kind of what it's done for liberty. It's not I'll admit, like, as a constitutional conservative, this is like my bread and butter here, and I love this thing. But even I have to admit that it hasn't protected inalienable rights as we understand it back then. And I think that's not exactly a problem of the Constitution. I think that's a problem of the human condition. If you believe in the Bible, God himself came down and gave us commandments, and even he couldn't get us to listen to them. So what hope does a group of men? You can write the best document ever. You could write a document that creates a government that is absolutely perfect. But if you're administering, men over men, I don't know what document is going to enforce itself on a person who's put in charge of other people, and that's the great problem I find. When I look at the Constitution, I see arguably what, at least right now, I don't see a better governing document that exists. And I think, again, its only tragedy is that the Constitution can't enforce itself.
Yeah, I mean, James Madison said a bunch of times it's a parchment barrier, meaning, yeah, it just that it's not going to enforce itself, and it is. I think honestly, I do think that it is the human race's last stand against tyranny, man. I think.
Oh yeah, I agree.
If that goes, everything goes, and the great struggle throughout human history is tyranny versus liberty, and tyranny's won most of the time.
Oh yeah.
I think, I mean, that's like such a deep question too, man. There's so many facets to that. I think a huge one, man, because if you look at like the early Republic period, people, especially guys that fought in the war, were still alive, and they truly believed in the things that they had sacrificed so much for. Daniel Shays Rebellion's a perfect example. The guys, the Whiskey Rebels, another perfect example, and they actually, if you look at Shays Rebellion, like these guys rose up and they believed, and I think they were right, that they were carrying on the principles stated in the Declaration of Independence and the Revolutionary War. However, the Massachusetts government, which was like hyper conservative, James Bowdoin and all them guys, like they didn't, they're the type that they would, they said the words, but they didn't believe in them at all. But so the point here is that there used to be some bottom-up enforcement from the people, but I think after centuries of centralization and public education, honestly, is the biggest problem. We don't have that type of, like, I cannot imagine today. Okay, so let's say I'm an Army veteran. Let's say a bunch of me and my Army vet buddies, we get pissed off and we decide to overthrow the government of Ohio. Even if number one, they'll probably kill us all unless we decide to fight a guerrilla war. But anyway, the point is that can you imagine how that would play in today's newspapers? People would freak out. What kind of reaction would that have? But back in Massachusetts in 1789, Shays Rebellion, people were sympathetic to the rebels because they believed in the same things they were fighting in. But if you look at what public schooling has done, I mean, we have the one nation under God, baby, type thing, where we have this idea of like the unitary nation where this is one country, not 50 little ones in a loose confederation. So the way that these things are presented to people is basically from the central government's viewpoint, or, from the Department of Education on down. And I mean, look, man, if if Walmart had a Walmart had a school system and Walmart was going to come to your house and throw you in jail unless you sent your kids there, right? So then your kids go there, they spend more time at Walmart schools than they do with you. And for 8 hours a day, when they walk down the halls, they see the pictures of Walmart CEOs. Every single morning, they pledge allegiance to Walmart. And they're told in school that we can't possibly exist without Walmart. Without Walmart, things would be chaos. Like Walmart needs to do this. Walmart needs to provide healthcare and education and all these other things. Would you be surprised at all after they come out of that if they reacted with extreme hostility to you suggesting, well, maybe some people can go to Costco and some people can go to Winn-Dixie or, these other stores? Of course not. So the fact of the matter is, like, people go to public school today. They learn what the state wants them to know, the federal government. And I think that the federal government doesn't want to acknowledge, like, this country's real history.
Oh, I mean, kids are not taught history. I mean, a lot of people I know in kind of the same space that we're in, professors and all sorts of people, I mean, they see these kids and they see, being a teacher, I mean, that's a whole nother thing in and of itself that is just insane, the process to become a teacher. And the whole thing is just insane when you really look at it. But yeah, I mean, we're not if we were serious about education, specifically American history, we would be studying American history and the Constitution from K through 12. You can't, at least even when I was growing up, I mean, we spent maybe 2 weeks on the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, as a part of a larger course of American history. But that's it. Oh my God, it's not enough. That's not even K through 12 isn't enough. I mean, I've spent the last 10 years just researching, and I have barely scratched the surface.
Yeah. And it's just like, if you do something as simple as like just reading the ratification debates, and then like the delegates spelling out exactly what was going to happen in this thing. And then if you look at what's happened, I mean, boom, right there, you're pretty much done. And even if you just read the document itself, like, okay, it says the federal government has 33 to 35 delegated powers.
Yeah, I was going to say, I counted 18 to 20. Where are you getting
Right.
30 and 35 from?
Between Article 1, 2, and 3, it's
Okay.
I can't.
You know, I'm thinking of Congress. You're right. Okay.
Yeah.
Congress has
Yeah.
about 18 to 20.
Yeah, and then the executive has 10 or 11. They're almost entirely centered around foreign policy, and
Yeah.
then the commander in chief stuff. And then of course
okay.
the Supreme Court, that's another that's another story for another day.
Oh, yeah,
there,
that's
which is
a
also a
beast.
huge problem. That the idea that the founders would have been mortified at the idea that 9 politically connected, unaccountable, unelected judges get to decide what the Constitution means for everybody. That was never the idea. So,
Yep.
of course. So, and that's another thing is that people think, even today, people think the Supreme Court is supposed to decide what the Constitution means for everybody. And it's like,
I know.
no.
Ugh.
Okay, so if you let the federal government interpret what the general government is allowed to do, of course they're going to side with the federal government. I mean, what does the guy's paycheck says when he cashes it? It says United States government. Are we surprised? But anyway, so yeah, man. I mean, there is absolutely a general lack of knowledge, but it's like it kind of breaks down to this. I think if you wanted to just kind of nail one central point, it's like the compact theory of the Constitution versus the unitary kind of theory of the Constitution. And the Civil War in Lincoln was what really screwed this up, of course, is originally people saw of course, back in the 1800s, people would say, hey, I'm a Ohioan, I'm a
Connecticut.
That's right, Connecticut. I'm a Rhode Islander. This people would identify with their state they lived in.
Yep.
Now people say I'm an American. But I think really what happened is in the 1860s, Abraham Lincoln and the Republicans rewrote the Constitution, and they changed it from a federal republic to a national government. And we're 150 years almost removed from that conflict. What's done is done, and I don't know if there's any way we could ever claw it back, barring a massive collapse of this society.
Well, I don't know. I disagree a little bit. I would say that the only thing holding back the states from assuming their rightful 9th and 10th Amendment powers is a bold leader and, your finances. Because right now, most states that I'm aware of are have massive debt and they require grants from the federal, or they're always begging at least for money from the federal government. So,
yes, that's part of the control.
Yeah, and so it's if you could get someone in there to get that, that's the thing. You'd have to be in there for probably how many years would it take to do that? But you would need a series of guys at least to get the finances under control, and then just start assuming the powers under the 9th Amendment. You have your state police. It's you have all the forces there. Federal government, the states are doing it now, slightly a little bit with marijuana in certain states. They're saying, listen, no, if federal officers try to enforce these laws, you arrest them.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and Madison said that there was really 4 big ways for the states to assert their power. One was to refuse to comply with officers of the Union, and then there were, I'm blanking on the other 3. But yeah, man, there is certainly a path. There is nullification, of course, which is being done, and
oh boy,
I think that's one of our most realistic ways forward, because that's what you're talking about, of course, with marijuana is the states nullifying federal law. So that is certainly a possibility, and I think it is probably the only way to actually claw back the federal government from the bottom up, because voting, you can vote every year on federal politicians and you'll just be disappointed and they're just going to grab more and more power and we're going to get in worse shape. I think our only chance is from the bottom up. Here's the thing though, is that I'm not so optimistic that I'm going to see some great retraction of federal government power in my lifetime. Really what I want to do is kick the can down the road and kind of hold back the floodgates so my kids and their generation can pick up the mantle and take it from there. Because, look, it took 250 plus years for the federal government to grow from, 100 employees to a $23 trillion a year monster state. We're not going to claw that back in a year or 2 or 10 or 20 even. It's going to take a long time, I think. It's
beyond our lifetimes. Yeah, it's going to be, we're going to have to, like you said, I think right now I feel like we're in a time right now where a lot of people are kind of revisiting liberty in a way, where people are, having to ask, revisit questions they haven't had to ask in thousands of years. Hey, wait a minute, we're living in, the physical world. government's kind of a reality of, is, pretty much a reality, as far as I'm aware. I don't know if any anarchy societies.
Very small pockets.
Sure. But, so they're like, well, what is better, liberty or tyranny? Okay, living under liberty is better. Like, how do we define liberty? What does it mean? Does it mean freedom to things? Does it mean freedom from coercion? Does it mean, the government's a service provider, or is it a protector of inalienable rights? Like, we haven't had to think about these questions for thousands of years, and now we're revisiting it, and they're, as simple as they are, like, hey, why does liberty even matter? It's right. Like, I'm almost like, oh my God, like, how do I even articulate this? It's like in my core, but how do I explain it to someone and to make them understand? And so we're kind of in a point where we're getting this knowledge together. And I think it's up to us to kind of, that's why I'm doing the podcast, is to get that message out. I think that's what you guys are doing as well.
Yeah, man.
And
educate
the people for the next generation so that they have the that grounding that they have. Maybe they'll inspire new leaders, and who knows, but anything to advance the causes of liberty.
Absolutely, and especially because I want people to retain the capacity to resist more than anything else.
Yes,
and that's not just firearms. Of course, that's a huge part of it, but it's also like it's
the arguments,
like
the ideas,
the mental capacity, right? Because if people are inculcated like they really are today, that the government's here to take care of you, it's here to provide you health care and education, and make sure your water's clean, and make sure that you don't screw in a light bulb that's too high of wattage for your front porch, or make sure your toilet seat's not too big, or make sure it's constructed the right materials, like all this crazy stuff, like. People accept that, and I think it's public education, man, because I had to unlearn so many things I learned in government school that and really, I mean, dude, I've always learned things the hard way. It took me years. It took me going to Iraq and then going to prison for me to kind of finally shake myself loose of kind of the stupor I had been in, man, and that was and if I hadn't had those experiences, who knows? Maybe I'd still be the right-wing nationalist that I used to be. I don't know. Who knows? But anyway, the point is that that's what I think it all boils down to, man. It is education. I don't think it's the only thing that people that care about liberty should be doing. I think that if you are interested in political action, I think you should pursue it. I mean, there's just the thing. It's like, like it's let 1,000 flowers bloom. Like everybody should be doing what they think is best to advance a cause. We all have different talents and abilities and resources too. So you and I can podcast, and we can, people can pick it up and listen to it and share it with their friends, and hopefully have some ammunition for arguments that they want to have with other people and win people over. Other people can, work on decentralization, nullification, like, nullifying federal law, so on and so forth. I honestly, I don't know what the way forward is. I just know what it isn't.
Yeah, I feel that sentiment. I think that, I think kind of going back to what I said earlier, I think we have the ideas. They're all there. I mean, our whole founding, it's all right there. It's just a matter of adhering to it, really. And I think that the best way to do that is to make the arguments, which, as I kind of said earlier, requires us to go back and kind of research these guys. I'm reading John Locke and Charles Montesquieu and, going through all this stuff. And I'm just like, this should have all been, like, in school. I feel like I should have already known all this stuff, even if I didn't care, like, hey, like, you will know Charles Montesquieu.
Right,
you will know John Locke. You will know James Madison. You will know these guys, even if you... Because, it's just, liberty is so precious and it's so fragile. And it's...
people, it gets all the encroachments on it get normalized, man. And, look at, like... I think that
we're complacent, because of I think economics, because our economic success. It's like, as long as I can get the latest iPhone, so what if if everything in my bathroom has, like shower heads have shower head flow rates, toilets have
gallons per flush,
exactly, and it's like and you open up your medicine cabinet, God, who even knows how many regulations there are there? I mean, thousands, infinite, I would say,
and. That's a big part of why we don't have more life-saving drugs, is because it's so expensive and difficult for drug companies to get past the FDA, is that they're only going to produce products that have mass market appeal, which is why you see a lot of drugs for COPD and congestive heart failure, high blood pressure, cholesterol, all these types of things. And that's why more rare conditions That's why you don't see drugs for those. And I mean, that's like economics right there. But I mean, I think there is something to that. As long as people are kind of materially comfortable, I think most people are just kind of fine with the status quo. Because I mean, why wouldn't they be? We live in the most prosperous country that's ever existed. Life is really pretty good here.
Yeah. No doubt.
Now like for I find it extremely frustrating when I'm told there's a law against X, Y, or Z activity that I want to do that's perfectly peaceful. I find that there's a huge problem with that. And the fact of the matter is that most of these things, people either don't think about them, they don't affect them, they don't care, or they've been conditioned to think it's for their own good.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And that's the
worst.
That's
of
a
it.
big old ball of string to unwind right there.
And I mean, even the Declaration says that men are more prone to suffer just because whatever they know is normal, they want to preserve that. They don't. Typically, people don't want to like uproot everything and change everything into something new. Like they like order, they like predictability, they like having their the normal customs and cultures. They like these things, and they're not going to change it for light and transient causes.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's the fear of the unknown is certainly a huge factor there. I think that's why a lot of people have like such a knee-jerk reaction against anarchism. Number one, like the word has been kind of given this negative connotation. Number two is that it is, for the most, it is unknown, and it is the unknown of people, and that scares people. And also too, of course, people don't realize like their interactions with almost every single human being every day are anarchistic for the most part. But of course, there is that fear of the unknown that, of course, I think keeps people. It's the devil you know versus the devil you don't, I think, in most people's minds. And yeah, man, it is. Like, that is the problem, is that once the government starts to take one of our freedoms away, it never gives it back without a hell of a fight.
Yeah.
Look at Fourth Patriot Act, man. I mean, that's the old saying, there's nothing as permanent as a temporary government program. We've all heard that before. But I mean, the Patriot Act, man, 20 years on, it just got renewed again, and they've removed a bunch of restrictions from what the state could do with the information and what information it gathered. We have all these types of intelligence gathering devices from the global war on terror coming back and using the United States. Stingrays, cell site simulators, automatic license plate readers, all these different surveillance tools that are everywhere with the most dude, the surveillance system in this country, it would make the Stasi blush. I mean, it's nuts, man. Everything you say, do, probably even think is recorded. The NSA can penetrate a computer that's air-gapped. Dude. So
I mean, every single person. I mean, it's funny because you think about it. I remember someone was saying a long time ago that some provision under Obamacare would or potentially inject you with kind of that chip or something that would
RFID.
Yes, exactly. And I just thought, why would they even do that? We have iPhones that gives us GPS, recording, video. They don't need to inject us with anything. We do it willingly.
Yeah, exactly. And that's just it, man, is that it's that thing where they convince you that something's for your own good. And now, of course, you can't really live without a smartphone. You have to have it. And now they really got you where they want you, mostly based off of convenience. But it's just like the surveillance thing. People have been conditioned to think, oh, this is good so they can catch terrorists or they can catch drug dealers. We have to have this so another 9/11
But at what
doesn't
cost?
happen. Right. Well, that's just that whole thing, James Madison, once again, it's John Adams, sorry. Fear is the foundation of most governments.
Yeah.
Now, of course, I would correct that and say fear is the foundation of all governments. But that is what it is, man. It's the state has a vested interest in keeping you afraid so they can do whatever they want to protect you. And that is what we're up against, I think, in a nutshell, man.
Absolutely. I want to conclude here with kind of what do you feel that, I guess, because I don't know, I've kind of always viewed anarchists as kind of more because I guess I don't know, I view them more as enemies of the Constitution, more enemies because the Constitution establishes the state, a government. They're we're not against, we're not for that. Maybe I just was talking to the wrong guys, but I feel like at least the guys that you and I think both kind of mutually in common that we follow, the Mongoose guy, the Luke guy. I'm butchering their names right now, but you know what I'm talking about. Binding
Bullet guys.
Yeah, those guys. I feel are we all on the same page? Is there something? Is there like a way to maybe unite us a little better, that would get us a little more organized to really advance liberty? I think in the way that we agree on.
I think that liberty has to be the focus. I mean, here's the bottom line: two things. Number one is that there's like there are multiple types of anarchists, of course, and like usually when you hear the term anarchist, it's like left wing, anarcho-communist.
Yeah,
like,
that's
like screw those guys. I don't know, but that's a totally different animal, and I think those people kind of have like a general dislike of the entire system. Period. Like the whole like the capitalist structure. I can't speak for them though, so I'm not going to veer too far off that. As far as anarchists go, there's a range of opinion. I'm more of a Lysander Spooner type. And Spooner, he didn't think the Constitution had any real authority. However, though, that's kind of talking past the sale. The bottom line is this: is that we are so far away from where we want to be today. I think there's no reason that we can't all work together, because as long as the focus is more liberty, I think we really that's the one thing that would unite us all, because it doesn't matter whether you're an anarcho-capitalist, whether you're a libertarian, whether you're a minarchist, whether you're a constitutional conservative. None of us are happy with the status quo, and we all really want the same thing, which is less government, and more liberty. And I think that's something we can all unite on. Now we all agree, we all might get off that bus at different points, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, absolutely.
But we're so many billion miles away from the first stop. I don't think it really matters. So it is. Yes. I think the focus is, and of course, like there are plenty of anarchists that are kind of jerks that will be like, oh, well, you're a statist because you want the Constitution. And it's like, nah, man, I don't see it that way. I think that I'm a fan of limiting government. Not so much a fan of limited government, but those two principles have one of the same, which those two things have a principle in common, which is shrinking the size of government. So I wouldn't call myself an enemy of the Constitution. I mean, like, once we get to the point where we're following the Constitution completely, then we can talk about that. Yeah, but until then, I don't really want to, I don't want to split hairs is what I'm trying to say. I mean, and the other thing too, like, maybe it's just sentimentality, maybe it's not, but I did swear an oath to support and defend it at one point in time in my life. And like, I really did care a lot about that at that time. And I mean, I still do to an extent. And part of that is like from, enemies, foreign and domestic, as part of that oath. The biggest enemy that we all have right now is the domestic one. So yeah, man, I don't know. I kind of have mixed feelings about the whole thing, honestly. And especially like if we can use because one thing I do really like about the Constitution is that it recognized the decentralized system that was already in place. I'm a huge fan of decentralization, because I think the more competition we have between political economies, the political units, the better off it is for all of us, because people can vote with their feet. That's the problem with the United States now, is that Connecticut and Ohio, I mean, yeah, there's plenty of big differences there, certainly. However, you're still under federal law, and you're still, the states are still enforcing mostly federally kind of what the feds want them to enforce, like drug laws, for example. So you can't really vote with your feet. However, if Ohio had its own legal code and Connecticut had its own legal code, then if you didn't like one, you could move to the other, and that gives people more choices, which is far better. So I do like the fact that even though the Constitution centralized power compared to the Articles, it's still, if the system is operating as intended, it's far more decentralized than most countries. Yeah. So I really do like that. I think that's a great strategy for liberty, is to decentralize things as much as possible. I'd love to decentralize them down to the individual, but I would be happy if we could decentralize things down to the states or even counties for now. Yeah,
I like how you worded that. Is that I just the more I'm talking to people via Twitter and doing the podcasting, you hear a lot of different points of views, and I'm just like, you have like conservative Democrats, all different kinds of conservatives. You have libertarians, all different kinds of them, and now anarchists and everything. And I'm just like, we all basically do want the same thing. I don't know, why are we so concerned with like, oh well, this guy believes like a little bit different than I do, or the best one I've seen is that like the reasons why you believe the same thing that I do, that's enough to keep me away from you. I've discovered that, and I'm like, you guys realize that the more infighting we do, the more like Bernie Sanders is like a heartbeat away from the, being president, basically.
Yep.
How the hell did this happen in America where, like 50 years ago, everyone unanimously basically hated communism?
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't that long ago. We had like the Red Scare and that, the whole McCarthy era, which, by all accounts from what I've read, he was right. There were communists in government.
Yeah, he had at least some. I mean, he had at least some kind of. He went way overboard with it, but he was at least partially.
I want to specify. I haven't done the full research on it, but I've done a kind of brief primer on it, and I was just like, oh my god, there were actually communists in the government. He was right.
Yeah, well, one interesting thing about him is like he was a hardcore opiate addict, and him and Harry Anslinger. Actually, Anslinger propped him up and supplied him with opiates from the drugs that federal agents had seized because Anslinger thought he was doing important work. But anyway, yeah, man, I know, dude. Like, part of it is social media and Twitter, and just people are just horrible on it. Period. The other thing too, it's the narcissism of small differences in groups that you tend to see with like quote unquote fringe movements. And here's the other thing too, man. I do wish that like there are two big points of friction I think between like kind of mainline conservatives and libertarians. One is the cops. Two, I think to a lesser extent, is the military. However, past that, there is one thing, man, and it's the reason that conservatism has been on the downhill for so long is that, dude, the left, they all get on the same page and they stick to the script.
Yes.
And the conservatives don't do that because there's more of an individualist spirit among them.
You're absolutely right.
And that's like a systemic thing, and I don't know how possibly that could be changed. And also, it doesn't help that a lot of Republicans are actually progressives.
Well, yeah, I mean they're Republicans in name only. The rhinos, as they're called.
Yeah.
But I look back at history, and I'm just like, you had the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, and they agreed on basically everything except for I mean, really, it came down to like a Bill of Rights, and ultimately it came to. Obviously, there were other differences, at the conventions and everything, but they were able to come together despite their differences. Like, to me, that like we were born in that kind of idea that, listen, we don't have to agree entirely, but we do have to agree on what liberty is. And as far as I can tell, we all kind of pretty much agree on that concept, that original concept of liberty, plus or minus some exceptions here or there. And I don't, it's in our blood. I don't see what's stopping us from uniting like we used to back in the day.
Yeah, man, that's a very good question.
I think it can be done. I guess it just needs to. I guess maybe there needs to be some kind of catalyst. Like maybe we're not going to learn our lesson until we get like socialism, and
Yeah, that's a strong possibility.
And I don't want to get into this. I mean, it could be anything, but it's like it doesn't have to be like this. But I said earlier, I think we're doing our parts to do what we can. I want to kind of close it off here. Final remarks on your thoughts on the conversation and liberty and everything in general.
No, it was good talking to you, man. I tend to be kind of hard on conservatives, and that's mostly because I used to be one. But I can you seem like you're more of like the old right, kind of like I don't know if you call yourself a paleo conservative.
Constitutional conservative. I don't even know what that means, paleo.
Paleo conservative is like the Pat Buchanan type of school, type of thinking.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yep, I know those guys. I'm more of like a pre-constitutional federalist.
Okay.
That'd probably be best to describe me. Or like an anti-federalist, really.
Sweet. Well, so here's the thing: is like Murray Rothbard, who's one of our, who's one of the biggest libertarian scholars.
Oh yeah.
He associated with anybody he could find that was anti-war because if you believe in the principles of libertarianism, like the worst thing the state can do is to fight wars. Number one, James Madison. War is the most of all the enemies to the public liberty. War is to be the most dreaded because it comprises and forms the germ of every other. From war, we get armies and debts. Oh my gosh, I screwed up the quote. But basically, armies, debts, and taxes are the known tools for putting the many into the domination of the few. So the bottom line here is that Murray Rothbard, I think, correctly saw war as the biggest threat to liberty. And so did the founders, too. So he associated with anybody who is anti-war. And I'm glad to do the same, especially, like, it's good to talk to you, man, to, like, talk to a conservative who's not, like, rah nationalism, like fight him over there if you don't fight him over here, because that stuff drives me insane, man, because it's like it's in such conflict with like the ideas in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and like of liberty. So I was glad to talk to somebody who is a conservative, who I'm not going to speak for you. I'm not saying you're anti-war, but like you at least like, I'm sure you at least want to, if we have to fight wars, then to be done constitutionally correctly.
Yeah,
which is a much, much better system than the way we have
well,
now.
Yeah, I think, especially with war, I mean, my position has always been like, if you do everything you can to avoid war. And we have a lot of interesting ways to do that now. We have economics, we have cyber warfare. Like, there's a lot of things we can do before you put boots on the ground. But if you make that commitment to put boots on the ground, we're not nation building. We're not, we're not doing any of this. We are literally going there to, as my father said, kill people and break stuff. He was in the Marines for 4 years. That's what the military does. Yeah, that's what he said. He was in the Marines for 4 years, and he said, yeah, they do two things. And it's like this whole idea, like, and this is where I feel like I could get myself in a lot of trouble, where it's like, I used to, war, you're supposed to kill civilians. Like, that was the goal of war. Like, in World War II... In World War II, well, I mean, how far... Vikings, I mean, God, how far do you want to go back? War has always been about just decimating, wiping out the enemy, and that's it. In World War II, even, I mean, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, firebombing Tokyo...
Right, Dresden.
Yeah, I mean, I guess allegedly they were military targets, but like the civilian casualties. But Tokyo wasn't.
Yeah,
we were trying to win a war, and it's like that's how wars should be, and that's why we shouldn't ever do them, because they're so horrible. If you try to humanize war, you incentivize more of it, I think.
I'm with you on the general thesis there. I think that there is like multiple schools of thought on that. Of course, like the European way of war, especially in like continental classical Europe, was limited warfare. It was basically two armies would go out to a field, meet each other out there and fight.
Yep.
However, our modern conception of war is total war, which is the Vikings. That's Sherman's march to the sea. That's burning Atlanta to the ground. That is killing civilians and deliberately targeting the civilian population. And with that too comes sanctions, because sanctions are a form of economic warfare, and they don't ever hurt the government. Like of the country we're targeting, they hurt the poorest and weakest among the population. So anyway, no, I mean, I can certainly respect your position. I think that one thing we have to keep in mind is that the state tends to lie us into war.
To get into war, yeah. And I don't doubt that for a second. I'm sure there's more nuance to it.
Yeah, war is the health of the state, man. That's because that's when they can grab the most power. So anyway, the kind of the point I'm getting to here is that conservatives that are anti-war, or at least like foreign policy realists that don't want us to have a massive military empire, because the thing is, what I want them to understand is that like that's what's destroying America, and that's what's destroying the constitutional system, federal system. It is global empire, because you can either have an empire or you can live under it. Like, that's your choice, basically, because it always comes home in one degree or another. And if we actually want to preserve the constitutional system, we actually want to preserve liberty, like, we have to get rid of that.
Yeah.
So
anybody I'm sorry, go ahead, finish your thought.
Anybody that can get on board with that, that's somebody I would certainly consider an ally.
Awesome. Well, yeah, I know we're like on the cusp of a second whole discussion I think we could have. But
hey, man, you can certainly come on my show, or you can have me on, another time. I'm sorry, scheduling's been so crazy. School's really killing me right now. So.
I know. Don't worry about it. I'm going to be in the same boat pretty soon here. But let's stop there, and then we'll definitely do a part 2, and we'll continue this conversation. Get into maybe war and what else? War, military, and kind of, and like you had mentioned at the end there that the greatest threat is the military, and I think there's some interesting things there.
The founders certainly thought so.
Well, standing army, yeah, they had a big problem with that, or the anti-federalists had a big problem with that, I should say. But yeah, let's cut it off there, and then we'll reconvene in a different time.
Sounds good to me.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on. I greatly appreciate it.
Hey, yeah, dude, it's good talking to you.